In 1973, the shroud was brought out for a brief examination by a group of European scientists. Among them was the late Dr. Max Frey, a Swiss criminologist and one of the leading experts in dust and pollen analysis in the world. Dr. Frey almost single-handedly developed a technique to determine where criminals had been by testing samples of dust and pollen from their clothing.
Max Frey was a friend of mine and a very good criminalist, and did a lot of work on the shroud with the same sort of tapes that we use. He found pollen grains that came from Palestine and that area. We didn't. On our examination of the shroud, we found very few pollen grains, an average of maybe 1 per square centimeter.
At first, Dr. Frey's objective was simple. If the shroud was forged in France in the 14th century, then only the French or Italian pollens would be found in the cloth. But his exhaustive analysis found some 58 specific pollens, only 17 of which were indigenous to Europe. The rest were from Palestine and southern Turkey, the site of Edessa and Constantinople. And this meant that the shroud had been in these places at some time in its history.
We had noted the presence of other objects on the shroud besides the body, and that we found, to our astonishment, the highly accurate images of many flowers. There are actually many hundreds of these, but we're able to identify 28 species of these flowers, but we feel a good degree of accuracy. The importance of this is that these flowers all grow either in Jerusalem or within 12 miles of Jerusalem. In addition, the pollens of 25 of these flowers, the 28 we found, have also been identified independently on the shroud. Whatever produced the image of the body, which some feel is the resurrection, also produced a high-energy field, producing images off every object that was in the shroud itself. And hence we have highly accurate images of these flowers.
It has been alleged that the type of linen, the herringbone pattern weave, was very rare in the Palestine area, but that it was a very common textile after the 12th century in Europe. This is simply not true. Neither the linen nor the weave were common in Europe. This same pattern is identical to mummy wrappings that go back as far as 2000 BC. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy man who received permission from Pilate to bury Christ's body. It is not unlikely that when he gave his tomb for the burial of Christ, he may have also used expensive Middle Eastern linen grave clothes that were intended for his own burial.
The physical shroud itself is one matter for investigation, but even more mysterious and more puzzling is the haunting image which appears on the shroud itself. The shroud may be traceable to the time of Christ, but is it an image of Christ or a painting by a very clever artist, as first claimed by Bishop Darcy and several modern-day scholars?
If it was the shroud of Christ, it would have to be made up of embalming materials and blood and other body fluids. What we found microscopically were pigments used by an artist, and a paint medium that was commonly used in the Middle Ages. This proves the shroud is a painting, a beautiful painting, but nevertheless the work of an artist.
Walter McCrone believes that the image on the shroud is either a directly painted image or an image perhaps reinforced with artist's pigment. One of the pigments he's identified is iron oxide, using optical microscope techniques, but an X-ray fluorescence scan of the entire shroud shows no more concentration of iron in the image areas than there is on the cloth itself. I don't believe the theory because there is so little pigment shown in the image areas on the shroud, and the image itself only consists of degraded cellulose fibrils, which have a yellowish color as viewed by the human eye.
No one has ever disputed the fact that he found real paint pigment on there. But it comes from the fact that when artists made copies of the shroud, they touched it to the shroud to gain sanctity for their creations.
The artist did an excellent job of creating an image that looks to be pretty much anatomically correct. You can find fault with it, the length of the fingers and the length of the arms, but still, artists, even 500 years ago, were able to paint figures that are anatomically correct.
To help determine the possibility of whether the shroud image is a painting, we asked Hungarian physicist and internationally known monumental artist Dr. Isabel Pizik who has studied artist depictions of Christ from the 1st century to the present day.
The professional arts do not think that the shroud could possibly be a painting. There are certain paradoxes which the professional artist can see looking at the shroud, which cannot be explained and which a professional artist could not have been doing today, yesterday, or in the Middle Ages.
The experts contend that the molecular paint traces found even in the unimaged shroud areas are simply dust particulates acquired over the years. Equally, they argue the unique effect on the fibril surfaces cannot be produced by any known paint and far more resemble a radiation burn than any kind of intentional coloration.
The shroud is definitely not a fake or a fraud. Many of today's most distinguished scientists are convinced the shroud is genuine. These scientists not only believe in its authenticity, but they also believe the weight of scientific evidence supports their beliefs.
Since 1977, when the people at Los Alamos National Laboratory first put the shroud into the P8 analyzer, this instrument has become associated with shroud research. The shroud photos taken in 1931 by Giuseppe Henry were analyzed on this equipment. Many people have sent me images to compare to the shroud. The EP8 analyzer can clearly distinguish a man-made picture from the real shroud image. The slope of a man-made picture is uniform and it rises to a fixed plateau. The slope of the image on the shroud is varied and agrees with the shape of a real face. We found that in the shroud's image there is encoded three-dimensional information which an artist could not have put there.
A particularly sensitive point of discussion with scientists on both sides of the issue centers around what is said to be bloodstains, according to Dr. John Heller and Dr. Alan Adler. The question is, are the stains actually blood? And if they are, how did they get there?
Heller and Adler reported blood. Whether they found blood, I'm not so sure. They had the same tapes that I had. I had more of them, but they had some as well, and they reported blood. I tested for blood, maybe not by 15 different tests, but by at least half a dozen. I found no blood. I will say categorically there is no blood on the shroud, period.
According to medical physicist Dr. John Heller and blood specialist Dr. Alan Adler, when paint is x-rayed, it shows up quite unequivocally. But these x-rays of the shroud do not show the blood spots, which means that the blood could not be paint. They determined not only that the markings on the shroud were indeed blood, but blood highly loaded with bilirubin, a bile pigment that would only show up if the dead man had been jaundiced or severely and traumatically beaten.
On the other side of the ocean, and working independently of Heller and Adler, the noted pathologist Pierre Bem Ballon came to the further conclusion that the blood spots on the shroud were human and of the type AB. But even if it has been scientifically proven that the image is not a forgery and that the blood is indeed real, what proof is there that this linen cloth is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ? Could a modern forensic pathologist be able to tell anything from an examination of the shroud? Dr. Robert Buckland is a former coroner and forensic pathologist from Los Angeles County. He is well acquainted with images of violent death and is able to tell us much about the shroud from life-size photographs of it.
This is a body of a 5-foot, 11-inch Caucasian male weighing about 170 pounds. On the head, there are blood flows resulting from numerous puncture wounds on the front, the back, and the top of the head. There's a swelling over one cheek consistent with a beating. The right wrist is covered by the left hand, but there is a puncture wound in the left wrist consistent with a crucifixion injury. The classical, artistic, and legendary portrayal of nails through the palms is incorrect because the structures in the hand are too fragile to hold up the weight of a man of this size without tearing free. There are streams of blood running down both forearms, originating in the wrist areas and controlled by gravity, so the blood flows toward the elbows with the arms elevated and outstretched. On the back, there are more than 100 lesions which appear to be scourge or whip marks. Historians have indicated that the Romans used a whip called a flagrum. This implement had 2 or 3 thongs, and at their ends were pieces of metal or bone which looked like small dumbbells. Here you can see how those end pieces from a Roman flagrum fit precisely into the scourge lesions on the body. Here on the front of the body is a large blood stain resulting from puncture of the chest by an instrument like a lance or a spear. This weapon penetrated the thoracic cavity through the pleural spaces and into the heart. Later, after the corpse was removed from the cross and turned, blood dribbled out of the chest wound and puddled along the small of the back. There's an abrasion on one knee consistent with a fall. Finally, a spike has been driven through both feet and blood leaked from those areas and has stained the cloth. The evidence of a scourged man who was crucified and who died of postural asphyxia and cardiopulmonary failure is clear-cut.
Impressive evidence indeed that the shroud could be the actual burial cloth of Christ. Even more evidence favoring the shroud's authenticity was forthcoming. In 1978, when the Shroud of Turin was exhibited for only the 4th time in the century, a team of 40 scientists, known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, using the latest high-tech equipment, examined the shroud for 5 intensive days. During the next 7 years, this tireless group spent 150,000 man-hours studying, testing, and interpreting the data from the shroud, making it the most intensively studied artifact in history. But the shroud advocates received a serious setback when one test, a carbon-14 dating analysis, produced disappointing results. An international news agency report stated that a test performed by scientists in 3 countries indicated that the shroud dated from the Middle Ages, somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390.
The radiocarbon dates that we obtained clearly put the shroud in the Middle Ages.
Carbon-14 is never used as a sole litmus test, yet the mood of the day seemed to accept the dating without question, and the press leaped to unwarranted conclusions.
Carbon-14 dating is far from